Again, welcome to everyone who's joined. I'm going to wait another 20 or 30 seconds to ensure we've got everyone on board, and I see we're already live on Facebook, so just give us a little more time. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is John Horning, and I am the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. It's nice to have you on today's webinar. We have Guardian supporters from all over the country taking part in this call, from up and down the West Coast, throughout the Rockies, and along the East Coast as well, and everywhere in between. It always surprises me and heartens me how the Guardians community is scattered all across the country. We also sometimes have people from the international community as well. So it's great to have you all. We've got a great webinar today with a bunch of great folks here to talk about a really fascinating issue. I love these webinars because they allow us to bring people together from all across the country. The pandemic, of course, continues to present its challenges, and one of the silver linings is that we've adapted to creating virtual community. So when we do these webinars, we try to bring together national issue experts, people from frontline communities, every once in a while elected officials, and almost always WildEarth Guardian staff. And we try to talk about critical issues at critical times. We have our purpose, is always to inform, to inspire, and to activate Guardians like you to help us advance our vision and create the kind of world we want. We will be taking questions from the audience on the half hour and towards the end of our webinar. So please bring any and all questions that you might have. You can provide them in the chat box. I want to also make sure I offer a special welcome to a couple of longtime Guardians members, Susan Selbin, who's been a Guardians member since 2010, and John Soyne, who's been a Guardians member since 2018. Just a special welcome to the both of you. Today, we're going to be talking about the Joshua Tree and the effort to protect and understand threats to the Joshua Tree. It's an iconic species for lots of reasons, celebrated by all kinds of groups for centuries, really. This webinar follows on the heels of WildEarth Guardians' tremendous groundbreaking legal victory in September. That legal victory will require the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to reconsider its decision to deny federal Endangered Species Act protections for the Joshua Tree. The agency now has to take into account the best available science, including climate change models, in its new listing decision for the Joshua Tree, which will be forthcoming. We'll learn more about that. With me today to discuss these matters is a special guest, Dr. Christopher Smith, who's a professor of biology at Willamette University. We also have Guardian's very own Jennifer Schwartz, who's a staff attorney and our lead litigator on our case, and Lindsay Laris, who is our wildlife program director. So welcome to each of you. It's great to have you. So I want to start with asking each of you to help our audience understand what an incredible species the Joshua Tree is, and just ask you to share a piece of your personal connection to the species, or some piece of its ecological uniqueness that you'd like to share. And I'll start with you, Chris, and then go to Lindsay and then Jennifer.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. And although I can't see all of you, thanks to the people in the cloud land who are watching. I'm an old-time desert rat. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and I've always loved all things desert-y. Tucson is the Sonoran Desert, where Joshua trees don't occur. And I didn't ever see them until my first year of college, when we took a road trip up to Las Vegas and we drove through the Joshua Tree Forest in Arizona. And at the time I was like, wow, those are really cool plants. I'm gonna have to go check those out sometime. But I didn't realize, oh, there's a picture of one. I didn't realize that I would be spending most of the rest of my life checking them out. And my interest in them is largely about their pollination biology. Joshua trees are kind of yucca, which are pollinated only by insects called yucca moths. Their pollination is really unusual because yucca moths have these mouth parts that we call tentacles. They look like an octopus's tentacle that no other insects have. They use those to grab pollen and put it right onto the spot on the flower where the pollen needs to go. Very unusual. Sure looks like the moths are doing it on purpose. Charles Darwin called it the most wonderful fertilization system ever published. And I've been studying that most of my career now.
That's incredible. I love when people's passions manifest in their embodied presence. You offered the dab of the yucca moth pollinating the Joshua tree there. That was beautiful. Thank you, Chris. Lindsay.
Yeah, I don't have anything quite as exciting as that to talk about, but I live in Denver right now, but prior to moving here, I spent the first sort of decade of my 20s into my 30s living in Los Angeles, and I think that the Joshua Tree has this very special place for those of us, the Angelinos, because it is, you go from this concrete jungle and you drive about 2 hours to the east, and all of a sudden you're in this bizarre land of these bizarre plants that I had never before seen in my life before moving out there. I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in New Jersey, and we do not have scenes like this out in New Jersey. So I would go out to Joshua Tree National Park and also to the Mojave pretty frequently with friends, camping and just sleeping outside under these trees, hiking around them. It is such an escape from the concrete jungle and the rat race of living in a major city to be able to drive only a few hours and have this. And I think unlike some other parts of the West where you have these amazing, national forests and parks just right there, this is the escape for people who live in Southern California most of the time, either the beach or the desert. And I, really wanted to work on this case when I came to Guardians because I want to protect this icon of the desert.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lindsay. Jennifer, how about you?
Yeah, so one of the things I enjoy most about being an environmental attorney is that I get to become a temporary expert about the wild places and creatures that I advocate on behalf. This temporary subject matter, then I learn all these cool factoids about plants and animals while I'm litigating cases about them. So I really didn't know much about Joshua trees, to be honest, before our lawsuit. But once I dove into the science, I developed this perspective of Joshua trees as somewhat of a paradox. That on the one hand, we have this prehistoric life form that has been around for roughly 2.5 million years, that can live up to 200 years in one of our planet's harshest, most extreme environments, yet it depends on this very rare convergence of events to reproduce and thus persist as a species. In fact, one recent study I read suggested that all the right conditions for new baby Joshua trees to establish themselves on the landscape likely only align a few times in a century. So I guess it's this sense of the seemingly resilient, long-lived, hardy desert dweller with its tough, dagger-like exterior that's also a really vulnerable species that struck me. And that was really reinforced, this vulnerability, when Lindsay and I took a trip out to Cima Dome in September. And that's the area of the Mojave National Preserve that burned in the large dome fire in California in the summer of 2020. And so as you can see, was really just a graveyard of charred Joshua trees for as far as the eye can see. These are not fire adapted ecosystems. Joshua trees, unlike the conifer forest where I live here in the Pacific Northwest, they did not evolve with fire. They really can't withstand fire impacts very well. And what we're seeing now is that there's these invasive grasses that have really spread throughout the Mojave that can now carry fire across broad swaths of desert habitat, where historically fire was very infrequent, and when it did happen, it was pretty small and confined. So yeah, it's kind of that weird combination of this seemingly resilient yet also very vulnerable species.
This is the challenge of being an activist, is you both are sort of articulate the wonder of and the majesty of these species, and then you have to confront the heartbreaking reality, and that image does so in shocking ways. Chris, I think the audience has a sense that Joshua trees are in trouble. What's the unvarnished truth about their status from your perspective, and what informs that perspective?
Well, things are bad, I think, is the unvarnished truth. We know that there is a biodiversity crisis happening now in general that is deeply exacerbated by climate change. The Mojave in general is facing a wide variety of threats, from global warming, drought. We are in the driest period for the Mojave in the last 500 years, and development. As we start trying to address the climate crisis, it is very clear that renewable energy is going to be needed, and that renewable energy development is very likely going to eat up huge sections of the Mojave. In the face of that, Joshua trees are also presented with this very significant ecological challenge. There have been predictions for a long time that Joshua trees will probably lose, so they'll probably go extinct over most of their range. And it goes back to the 90s. One of the things that's really been striking to me is that I can actually see that happening on the landscape. I can go to places and find, oh, there are no seedlings here. And that pattern, that observation of mine, has been reinforced by work that Cameron Barrows and Lynn Sweet at the UC Riverside did, looking at Joshua Tree National Park, where they find that the only places where there are seedlings are up at the very highest elevations. That's compounded by the problem that we just heard about from Jennifer, the proliferation of invasive grasses that carry fires. In addition, during these extended drought periods, there's greater mortality for the seedlings. The plants are less likely to set seed, and herbivores, so gophers and rabbits and squirrels that normally might be feeding on other things will actually attack the trees and start chewing away at the trunk. That's especially a high source of mortality for young trees. So we see them being hit sort of from all sides: drought, increasing temperature, herbivory, fire, development. Joshua trees are in trouble.
Well, nothing unvarnished about that. As I was listening, I was thinking of Aldo Leopold, and when he said what it means to be an ecologist is to live alone in a world of wounds. And thankfully, I don't think we live alone in that world of wounds as he described, but it is still, again, pretty heartbreaking, because I don't think enough people know that the harsh reality that Joshua trees are facing. So thanks for at least starting us off with having to confront that reality. So that harsh reality is really what led Guardians to take action. Lindsay, I'd like you to give the audience some of the background about what Guardians has done to try to secure protections for the Joshua tree.
Sure, and just to play off your statement, John, I don't think that a lot of people know about what's going on with the Joshua Tree. And that's part of what the work that we do at Guardians is, not just litigate and get these good results, but raise awareness to ensure that there's action happening from the government. So I know some of this predates my time at Guardians. I started here in 2019, and John, I believe that it was probably your influence of really starting to look at the Joshua Tree and other climate imperiled species in the deserts, in the Mojave, as well as the Sonoran Desert. And in 2015, Guardians filed a petition to list the Joshua Tree, both the species, the eastern and western species of Joshua Tree, because we were seeing in the foreseeable future that there would be a threat, that there was a threat. So we were seeking threatened status under the Endangered Species Act. In September of 2016, so within a year, there was a 90-day positive finding from Fish and Wildlife Service, and essentially that means there's enough there to warrant a decision. Potentially substantial scientific information exists. And under the Endangered Species Act, the government is supposed to, within 12 months then, do a published rule one way or the other. Well, by the time I started, it was 2019, and it was August of 2019. We hadn't seen anything come out in 3 years, almost 3 years. So we started thinking about litigation, and what it started out being was actually just to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to do their job, to do a listing decision. So interestingly enough, we filed a deadline suit, which is when you're going to do this. And within 3 days, the government came out with their decision. And we don't think there was anything planned. It was purely coincidental, but it was interesting timing nonetheless. So that was August 2019. There was this decision that was published by the government saying listing is not appropriate at this time. There is not really a threat, ignoring the climate models that we had relied upon in our petition, even from 4 years earlier. They did not see a threat, declined to list. And really within 2 weeks after that, we took really quick action, sent out a notice of intent to sue. And then we, in November 2019, Jennifer and the wildlife program team, we put together this complaint, filed in the district court in Southern California, knowing sort of that optics, that judge would really get what's going on with climate, maybe in a way that if it had been in DC, it wouldn't have been the same sort of story. And then we started litigating the case. So I think that Jennifer is better able to talk about that.
So before we turn to you, Jennifer, Lindsay, just to help the audience and help me remember this, the first finding, the positive 90-day finding, was that under Obama, under the Obama administration?
For 2016, so now I'm lapsing on my presidential terms.
Yeah.
Still Obama at that point.
Yep.
I believe, yep. So it was very end. So we had a positive finding, and then just sort of ignoring all of that with the decision that came out in August 2019.
Yep. So that sort of sets up my question that for Lindsay, with the Trump administration, like having a cornerstone of its approach to all these issues, a cornerstone being climate denial and a total indifference to the biodiversity crisis, we had to know we weren't going to get a favorable finding and progress. What did we do about it in that context? And generally speaking, what recourse do we have when agencies politicize science and deny protections that species deserve?
Yeah, that's when Guardians takes the government to court. I mean, we would like to think that the government's doing its job, but when the government needs to be held accountable, we're not afraid to go in there and litigate. And we have some great in-house litigators like Jennifer who are able to do that for us.
So Jennifer, tell us, what did we do and with that finding that we knew was flawed?
Yeah, it was pretty evident to us from the get-go that Fish and Wildlife Service failed to follow the ESA's mandate to base its listing decision solely on the best available science. So when they issued their final listing decisions, that was also accompanied by a status assessment, which is supposed to contain the agency's underlying supporting scientific rationale for its listing decisions. And that's where we saw the service blatantly disregard modeling forecasts from all 5 of the available peer-reviewed published studies that show significant climate change-driven habitat loss, as Dr. Smith was mentioning, in the future, by century's end. The service also really cherry-picked the science and downplayed other threats like wildfire and development. So as Lindsay mentioned, we promptly sent the service a letter of our intent to sue, which is what the ESA requires that you do before a party can actually go file a lawsuit in court. And in this case, and probably most cases, we just got a cursory response saying that the service stood by its decisions. And so then, yeah, in November 2019, we filed our complaint in federal district court in Los Angeles, and that's what starts the case. And then we move on to filing our detailed written arguments over what we think the service got wrong. And that's what we call the merits phase of briefing the case. And that's where we point to all the legal precedent, how other courts have interpreted the ESA's requirements, and also all the scientific evidence that was before the agency at the time of its decision that we think contradicts its ultimate conclusions. And we were so convinced actually in this case that the service really messed up its analysis by ignoring all that key climate science that we even reached out after filing our opening brief. And this was shortly after the Biden administration had taken over to see if they wanted to settle the case, to agree to voluntarily redo their listing decisions after they saw our arguments and us pointing to the record. But they declined. And so we were forced to move forward with the litigation. And on September 20th, we got a great opinion from the court agreeing with us on all counts and ordering the service to go back and grapple with all the contrary science that they ignored and to reconsider listing either or both species of Joshua tree as threatened or endangered. So that's where we're at now. The service must issue new listing decisions, and we're discussing how to get that done as expeditiously as possible. Oftentimes we see a lot of agency foot dragging here, so we're working with them to get that out promptly so these desert icons can really get the federal protections that they deserve and need.
Thank you for explaining all that. Before I bring it back to you, Chris, to talk about some of the climate science, I'd like you, Jennifer, to talk about some of the drama, just briefly, in the court hearing, because it was pretty unusual, actually. So if you could just describe that.
It was. I mean, this case was somewhat delayed because first we had to argue over what the service produced in the record. They were withholding certain documents, initial drafts of their assessment that we thought showed much more candid predictions over the dire fate of the Joshua tree. And so they wanted to kind of withhold that from the court's review. So we had to argue over that with motions, which we successfully won. And then so we finally had a hearing, an oral argument. After you get all your written arguments in, you'll usually have a hearing scheduled. And, we're still in pandemic world, so this was on Zoom, and this was in August. And I had worked my butt off preparing. This is a very science-dense case, so I had this whole basically slideshow of these species distribution models and all this technical stuff to really walk the judge through it and explain where the service went wrong. And right out the gate, the judge was pretty much, Guardians, I think your position is more reasonable than the government. Ms. Schwartz, I don't believe I need to hear from you today. And that's when I turned into my little school child of like, but I have a whole slideshow, Your Honor. But I need to listen to the judge. If he doesn't want to, hear my whole thing, I wasn't going to go on about it. But the government did. They kind of launched into the argument that they wanted to give, despite the judge indicating where he was going and not wanting to hear it. He did say, I just have one question. After saying he initially planned to channel his inner Clarence Thomas and just remain quiet, he said, actually, I do have just one question for you defendants, and that's, will you consider a redo? And I'm thinking, I think that means we won. And that's when, the Department of Justice attorney kind of launched into a strident no. and went on about how, things were still too uncertain, basically, to list the Joshua, that the science just wasn't there. And, he put his head down, was kind of shaking his head, not buying it, clearly. And that was that. So it was a very short hearing, not the long drawn out science presentation that I had anticipated. But yeah, that's pretty much as close to a ruling from the bench that I think I'll probably ever see in my career. It's pretty unusual.
Yeah, it's
And
pretty
just-
amazing. I
just to
remember.
add to that, as
Go ahead.
being in the virtual peanut gallery, when he did, kind of shake his head, he did say sad, basically, that the government would not go and settle this case with us, which was pretty interesting. And this is a judge who is a George W. Bush appointee. This is not somebody that we necessarily thought would be on our side. We thought it was going to be a challenge convincing him. So to get that sort of response from a judge that you just had these preconceived notions of thinking a certain way was really, really great to see that science actually could be persuasive, regardless of politics.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Lindsay. That was a critical part of the story, just that the judge put his head into his hands and literally sort of under his breath said what you said, sad. So back to from the courtroom drama to some of the scientific drama. So one of the things that is the Joshua Tree case brings up is some really interesting issues that are at the intersection of science, policy, and the law. One of those issues has to do with predicting and understanding the effect of the climate crisis on imperiled species. I know that, Chris, you were asked by the Fish and Wildlife Service to be one of the peer review experts on the Joshua Tree listing decision, and so uniquely positioned because of that. Could you describe how some of the science, and in particular, the species distribution model or models played a key role in bringing to light the nature of the threats faced by the Joshua Tree?
I'm delighted to. I do want to do a little positionality statement in that I'm not a legal expert, and so I don't actually have an opinion on whether or not listing is warranted or not, but I do have an opinion about the science and the scientific evidence. And a lot of the concerns that we have about Joshua trees are not things that we see on the landscape, like fire or failure to reproduce. A lot of that is based upon modeling results. And the method that many scientists use now are something called species distribution models. And what that means basically is taking and looking at all the places where a plant or an animal occurs now, and then using some satellite or weather data to evaluate what is the climate today like in those environments. And then those are combined with a climate model that will predict where will environments like that occur in the future. And all of the models that have been built to date all show dramatic declines in the distribution of Joshua trees, from 75% loss to total extinction. And those models, I mean, they are kind of like a weather forecast. Weather forecasts certainly can be wrong, but most of the time they tell you something useful. And I think in some ways the service was in a little bit of a challenge space because climate models are most of what they had to work with. The only really other solid data about the impacts of climate change were this work that I described that was done at Joshua Tree National Park with folks from UC Riverside. And what those data showed, where they actually looked at on the landscape of where are there Joshua trees growing, they were completely in line with what the climate models predicted. And so in making an assessment of what is the future likely to hold, really the best available data and the best available science that the service had to work with were climate models. But they chose not to include those and to discount them entirely. And in the revised species assessment that came out after it was reviewed, essentially the argument was, well, distribution models are unreliable. And I guess I would say, yep, the weather forecast is unreliable sometimes too, But if it says pouring rain today in Portland, which is pretty likely, I'm going to go carry an umbrella and not go outside assuming that it's going to be 90 degrees and sunny.
And maybe this is a question for Jennifer, but maybe for you, Chris. Why do you suppose the agency just outright didn't take that into account? And feel free to feel that, Chris.
I'm not sure that I can. At first, I can't put myself into their minds, and I think what information I have to guess about that is probably privileged. So I'm not going to answer that, but I will say it was a bad choice.
Okay, thanks for that, Jennifer. Do you want to add anything to that, or Lindsay?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so critical to the litigation, these models, the results all reaching very similar conclusions. Like I said, I believe I mentioned that there were actually 5 of these species distribution models. The more recent, just getting more and more sophisticated, but all reaching very similar results. And so by pointing the court's attention to those models, the judge was really able to see that there's these very dire predictions for the Joshua Tree's future that the service summarily dismissed. And it's a fundamental tenet of administrative law that federal agencies can't just disregard an entire body of peer-reviewed published science that contradicts its conclusions. They have to discredit those studies on the record and then point to some countervailing evidence. And the service really couldn't do that here because all the evidence really does point in one direction. And excuse me, as I alluded to earlier, the ESA mandates that the service follow the best available science. Courts have made clear that that doesn't mean the best possible science. So our federal agencies and the service in particular can't demand absolute scientific certainty with these listing decisions, but that's what we see so often happen. Generally when they're demanding more definitive information, it's often just a classic stall tactic to delay taking meaningful action because of the perceived regulatory burden of protecting imperiled species and their habitats. So I think that's what we saw going on here, and certainly under the Trump administration, when we were dealing with an administration rooted in climate denialism and this misconception that if a species is listed or critical habitat is designated, it's going to shut down all economic activity. And that's just not the case.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's the opposite of a precautionary approach to species protection. And we'll get more into that a little bit later in the conversation. I wanted to get to at least one question from the audience, but before I do that, I just want to remind audience members that, as I said at the outset, the purpose of these webinars are to inform, inspire, and activate. And Eleni's going to put into the chat box our action alert on this. We want to put as much pressure as possible on the Biden administration and the Interior Department to take swift action. We've got this great legal decision, of course, but the agency needs to get as much public pressure as possible to fulfill its mandate. So please take that action if you can. Here's the question. It's from Richard Spots, who's a longtime Guardians member, former BLM employee, and it is preceded with a comment. ESA listing of Joshua trees would be a positive step forward, but not a panacea. Mojave Desert tortoises were listed as ESA threatened in 1990, and most tortoise populations continue to rapidly decline. Another piece of unvarnished truth. BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service have not only failed to stop this decline, but have actually contributed to it through a long pattern of harmful decisions. We need to reform regressive BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service management cultures. Without reform, we won't make progress on Joshua tree or tortoise recovery. What do you think? You want to take that, Lindsay? And then if both Chris and Jennifer want to speak up, please just follow Lindsay.
I mean, I think, yes, that's all very true. And, we have certainly gone and done a lot of listing work at Guardians that predates me, and realizing now that it's not just the listing, it has to go beyond that and holding the government accountable and ensuring public pressure on administrations, not just to do what they're supposed to do under the law, but to get that right amount of funding to be able to do it, because we hear that a lot, that they can't take actions, they can't do certain things because of funding. Various other priorities get higher status than, you know, some of the species work. So I think, yes, reform is necessary. I think the listing piece is just the small first step, and ensuring that folks know about what's going on and putting pressure on these agencies to do the right thing and do what they're supposed to do is a really crucial second, third, fourth, fifth step.
Jennifer, longtime BLM grazing activist. What would you add to that, both through the lens of the Joshua Tree case and?
Yeah, I certainly wholeheartedly agree with that comment. And I think in particular, when it comes to climate imperiled species, we know the ESA isn't the legal mechanism to solve climate change. The goal here with species listing is that it triggers the agency's other obligations, and most critical in this context with climate change is recovery planning, forward looking, how to help species adapt. So that's really the key here. And I can talk a bit more later about some of those other substitute protections that'll come into play. But yeah, that's going to be essential here.
Anything to add, Chris? I can move the conversation along if not, but.
I only to agree that indeed we continue to see declines in tortoise populations and other threatened species despite listing.
Jennifer, you mentioned the importance of recovery planning. I want to kind of shift the conversation now to thinking about what happens next in the context of the challenging political environment and the challenging ecological reality that Joshua Tree and other desert species face. You alluded in your opening comments, Chris, about the various threats to the Joshua Tree, and there's an intersection here around the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And so let me just ask the question here and stick to my script. As a climate impacted species, the plight of the Joshua Tree raises really, really challenging questions about the role that the Interior Department, through both Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM, that they could and should play in solving these compounding crises of climate and biodiversity. At Guardians, we've had this guiding principle, which is just that, that we shouldn't enact solutions to the climate crisis that worsen the biodiversity crisis. I'd like for you, Chris, to explain kind of the underlying context for this issue and your opinion about these matters. And then I'd like to have you, Lindsay, weigh in, and likely you, Jennifer, as well.
Thanks. So I think my perspective is that the climate crisis is the biodiversity crisis, that the number one threat to species diversity is climate change. And for organisms like Joshua Tree in particular, we're sort of in a catch-22 in that addressing the climate crisis means converting to solar energy. And I'm not an energy economist, but my understanding from reading the works of economists and civil engineers is that we have to have industrial scale solar development if we're going to get to carbon neutral. It's a reality. And that means that the Mojave in particular is going to be under extreme threat for development. I would like to see a world in which we can do everything we can to protect diversity while also working on the climate crisis. And to me, what that means is recognizing that there are some populations, some places where Joshua trees are going to be gone no matter what we do. We know that the climate crisis is baked in at this point. The carbon emissions are so great that we are going to see dramatic changes. And there are going to be some places where Joshua trees simply cannot persist, given a choice, I'd rather see a solar development in a place that's doomed anyway, rather than in a place where Joshua trees might actually have a fighting chance. And the work that I'm trying to do as a scientist is to identify where are the places on the landscape where the Joshua trees are going to have the suitable climate, even under increasing warming. Where are the places where the Joshua trees look like they're still growing, they're putting out seedlings? Where are the places where the Joshua trees have the genetic variation necessary to adapt to a changing climate? And then those are the spots where you put your conservation effort and your conservation money. Unfortunately, we're kind of in a triage situation where we have people with who are bleeding out coming into the emergency room, and we have to decide who gets care.
So are the tools to assess, to do that triage, basically the ecological tools, the same climate models that both you and Jennifer have talked about that have informed listing, or what tools enable you and others to assess how to do that really hard reckoning of ecological triage?
I'm just saying that's a question to me.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't include.
No, I just want to make sure I'm not taking up too much with.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so yes, species distribution models are one of the tools that we would be using. Those also need to be validated by on-the-ground measures. So for example, the work that I was describing that Canberra's did, that's looking at one part of the range of Joshua Tree. What we need to be able to do is go across the range and see, are there places that are predicted to be climate refugia, places where Joshua trees could live into the future? Do those all actually look like they're places that are healthy for Joshua trees now? My research group is also working on sequencing the Joshua tree genome and identifying genetic variants that might be involved in allowing trees to better survive drought and heat stress. We're doing an inventory of genetic variation across the range to try to figure out where are places where Joshua trees have that genetic variation. And we're doing some experimental studies involving both a series of common gardens that are set up across the desert and some manipulative experiments in growth chambers where we can actually induce heat stress or drought stress and see how different genetic variants of Joshua trees survive. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Lindsay, what would you add?
I am not a scientist, so I defer to all of those pieces. I think that that's important, but I mean, I agree. It's hard choices. Yes, we need solar energy. We need development. I can't speak to, is there a way to do that without destroying the environment around it? I don't know enough about these projects and about what's going on. I think Chris alluded to sort of certain locations that maybe are better, and maybe there are sort of in the southern Mojave places that we can't have Joshua trees, but it doesn't mean that we can't make sure the ones that are at the higher elevations at the SEMA Dome where Jennifer and I were and she showed those pictures, that's, you know, maybe to be identified as a better location to have Joshua trees, and let's put more investment energy into that and recovery of those areas and into ensuring Joshua trees survive in those places.
Great. Your comment, Lindsay's inspired Chris, who's got a question, and then I'm going to go back to both you, Lindsay and Jennifer, but go ahead, Chris.
So the SEMA Dome fire raises an example of ways that you can effectively put forth your conservation efforts. It is, I'm going to say likely, based upon modeling work that I've seen that is unpublished, that SEMA Dome was one of the areas where Joshua trees probably could have persisted based on what the climate is likely to be in the future. But that population now has been very heavily impacted by fire. Same thing has happened in Joshua Tree National Park. And what we could do if we knew these are the places that really matter, you can then take management actions to try to protect those. Then that could be clearing grass, or that could be creating fire breaks. Work like that has been done in Joshua Tree National Park to try to protect some of the areas that may be climate refugia in the park, places where the trees could persist in the future. We need to continue to do work like that.
I find that both just interesting, encouraging, and a little discouraging that a population that was likely to be resilient is now gone at a scale that is both ecologically significant and visually heartbreaking. But I want to get to one other question for you, Lindsay and Jennifer, and then get to a few audience questions because it looks like we've got a few more. I want to talk about the Interior Department, both in the context of the Joshua Tree, the policies and actions that they've taken. I know from my history of dealing with the agency, it's fairly typical. Using the Joshua Tree as an example, what does the agency need to do better, differently in order to better respond to the biodiversity crisis at a time of such tremendous urgency? And why don't you go first, Jennifer? Haven't heard from you in a little bit, and then you go, Lindsay.
Sure. Well, I'd say first and foremost, Interior needs to recognize, as I think our legal victory for the Joshua Tree signifies, that the days of federal agency officials just throwing their hands in the air and unreasonably insisting on more definitive information about how climate change is fueling biodiversity loss is over. There's a growing body, as we keep discussing, of increasingly sophisticated science that's now able to reliably predict how current and the most likely future greenhouse gas emissions scenarios are likely to alter the environmental conditions that people, plants, and wildlife all depend on. So Interior needs to heed those projections and shift to recovery planning and climate adaptation for indicator species like Joshua Tree. So, as I mentioned, the ESA, of course, isn't going to be the solution for climate change. But again, it triggers the agency's duty to figure out how to help species best adapt. And for instance, like Dr. Smith was saying, identify areas of climate refugia. What are those areas that are going to be, the best, the most likely places where these species can continue to persist? And then we can use the tools of the Endangered Species Act, like the requirement to concurrently designate critical habitat, to give those areas the maximum protection under the law so they're not threatened by other forms of habitat degradation. So that could be like large-scale energy projects, not where it's going to happen. We have other alternatives for siting these things than those pockets of climate refugia. It's also going to trigger that recovery planning duty to look at other climate-backed mitigation measures. Again, that could be devoting more federal resources to combating all these invasive grass-fueled wildfires, or possibly helping Joshua trees regrow when climate refugia does burn. Like in Sema Dome, it really was disappointing because scientists are already seeing in so many parts of the southern Mojave, they haven't found new seedlings in much of that area for decades now. Whereas in Sema Dome, that was where they were still reproducing. So that could be a worthwhile endeavor to look into those types of measures. So those are the types of forward-looking shifts that we need to see at Interior.
Thank you, Jennifer. Lindsay, what would you add?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is, on a need to act more quickly, especially as the climate crisis worsens. As we're seeing now, we're getting the decision going back to the agency. It's been 6 years since the initial petition. We've regularly seen it take 14 years to get a species listed. If it's 14 years until you're even starting the recovery process, starting these tools, that's not what the law ever intended. It was 1 year. And it is just not the way that we're going to actually save any species for recovery. If we, as Jennifer said, need to have this perfect science and perfect decision-making in order to actually get to the listing phase, then we're going to be losing a lot more species. So we need the government to really stand up, do things in a more swift and nimble fashion. And if that involves more money going into this agency to do that work, that's what's really needed in order to prevent some biodiversity loss going forward.
Tremendous challenges, cultural, ecological, political. I mean, this is where Deb Haaland, as our Interior Secretary, has a tremendous challenge and opportunity to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to change the whole mindset and culture around listing and to just move with greater urgency. I want to get to a couple audience questions and then have the last 4 or 5 minutes for reflections from each of you. So let's try and get to 2 or 3. This one's from Ryan Orr. What is being done in the heart of the Joshua tree's habitat? The Victor Valley is a considerably conservative enclave in an otherwise progressive state and is home to more than 750,000 residents. 90% of the elected council members in cities such as Adelanto, Apple Valley, Hesperia, Victorville, and Barstow are openly right-leaning pro-growth. The Greater High Desert Chamber of Commerce is vehemently against protecting the Joshua tree, and its members number more than 650 businesses. I haven't seen anything being done, grassroots or otherwise, to attempt to engage and or educate this audience. Tough question. Lindsay, Jennifer, you want to take that? Again, not an easy question, but we got to feel.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack at it. I think first it's important to note that the vast majority of Joshua tree habitat does fall on federal land. So that does give us somewhat of a conservation advantage. I think what the commenter here is referring to is the southern population of the western Joshua tree. About half of that southern population is private lands. And so it's true that this federal listing that we're working towards would actually have very little impact on private land development, unless there's some sort of federal agency nexus, like they need a federal permit, which could be the case for large scale development. This wouldn't control that. But California is smart and did the right thing and agreed to list that western Joshua tree population as threatened or endangered, or at least it's given a candidate status right now. And so the state law may have some protections for those private lands, whereas what we're looking at is really conserving the best of the best, and that's going to be our federal lands habitat. And interestingly enough, that kind of can be possibly one of the more areas that we have to come to terms with sort of letting go based on what the climate projections are. We have this convergence of threats in that southern population for the western Joshua tree, where despite private lands development and all of that, that's the area that we're already seeing climate impacts. That's the area where scientists are already seeing the lack of recruitment of new young baby trees. And so, you know, temperatures have already risen. Nighttime temperatures are already so high that, you know, you're getting these evaporation rates where water just is not reaching any new young trees, these mega droughts. So that area of the southern Mojave is already hardest hit by these threats. But that points to the need for federal listing so we could, you know, keep our eye more closely on that northern population that's mostly on federal lands, and the other half of that southern population that we can still maybe do something about. Not to say that we should give up on all Joshua trees on private lands, but the fact of the matter is we just can't save them all.
Lindsay, what would you add?
I just wanted to add, like, yes, as you mentioned, the California Department of Fish and Game is engaged with the state listing process. And I think we Guardians don't work in California on the ground very much, but I do know there's a lot of groups that are. And I think Dr. Smith put some links in there, put some groups in there. And I think it involves a lot of pressure on CDFG to actually enforce what they're going to put in place for Joshua trees on the state level and on private lands in the state.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to, speaking of climate change, our green energy building is turning off the lights on me because I've been sitting still too long. So there was a question there about outreach, and there are a number of organizations that do environmental education work in the San Bernardino, Victorville, Antelope Valley area, including Cal Native Plant Society, Mojave Desert Land Trust, Transition Habitat Conservancy, and the Desert Institute, which is an arm of the educational arm of Joshua Tree National Park, which does quite a bit of outreach work about conservation education. I think the person asked the question does bring up a larger issue, which is about sort of the politicization of climate change, and that it may be hard to reach some people if they are just solidly against the idea that anything needs to be done about climate change no matter what.
Yep. Part of the challenge of reckoning with both wanting some degree of local political support for this, and also that federal protections are key and federal leadership is key as well. We just have a few more minutes before we hit the top of the hour. Want to be mindful of our 2 p.m. Mountain end time here. So I wanted to close with reflections from each of you. This is an incredibly challenging species to recover, given the complexity of issues, again, ecologically, politically, and culturally. I really do want to ask this question: are there reasons to be hopeful? And if so, what are they? I like to leave our audience with some sense of why we should be hopeful. And if that's not the question you want to answer, then I ask you to answer the question that feels most relevant to you as a closing reflection here. And if you each want to take a minute or so, that'd be great. Anyone want to go first? If not, I can ask.
I can go first. I
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the outcome in our case, and I know this is just the mini step even before the first step, I think we got a lot of other groups and saying that we were not going to win. This was not an issue to take on, that the science wasn't really there. It's very hard to get a judge to disagree with the federal government. And here we went into court and got a judge that was not somebody we expected to be on our side to say you need to look at the science. And that to me was very uplifting to, kind of be in this David and Goliath situation and going in there and, coming out of this with a huge win. And I know that's not everything for the Joshua Tree, but it makes me hopeful that at least we have the court system as a backstop to bad decisions that are made by the federal government, and that we do kind of have some of these checks and balances. We just need to move more quickly. And I am hopeful that will happen.
Thank you, Lindsay. Chris, you want to go next?
Sure. I think there are two things that give me hope. One is that in going to places where fire damaged and killed off Joshua trees decades ago, sometimes I do see Joshua trees resprouting from rootstock. And so you'll find these almost like sort of fairy rings where there's all these little miniature trees that were surrounding where there was once a trunk, which makes me think that maybe some populations can survive fire. But I think, to me, the thing that is the most hopeful is seeing, really surprisingly to me, how many people actually care deeply about these plants. As a sometimes botanist, we talk about how people have plant blindness, that most people seem not to notice or care about plants, and this seems to be an exception. So that makes me happy.
Cool. Jennifer, what are your closing thoughts? What keeps you hopeful?
Yeah, both of what Lindsay and Chris said really resonates with me. So yes, to our third branch of government, to restoring my faith and providing that check on our other branches of government. But I do think it's just imperative to remain hopeful when you do the kind of work that we do. So I really look to the great work of my colleagues and our broader community around the globe of people that are so committed to staving off the worst of what climate change and the extinction crisis can bring. And I really have seen a shift, I feel like, in just the majority of Americans that now view climate change as a top priority for our government to address. And that really wasn't the case just 5 to 10 years ago. And now it seems like it's dominating news cycles. Unless I just watch or listen to too much NPR, have my NPR colored glasses on. I don't know, but I think those are sources of hope.
Great. Well, thank you to all three of you. Your courage in carrying on the work of understanding the ecological challenges of fighting the good fight in court. It's I know it's inspiring to people, not just that are Guardians members, but people all around the country and the world that have been inspired by the magic of the Joshua tree. And I like to think that this evolutionary partnership between the yucca moth and this plant that's been around for millions of years, that somehow, given all the people who care about that and the human partnership that is emerging all over the West and in California and in Nevada and Utah as well, that too will somehow keep this species alive for millions of years into the future. So thank you to the audience for your questions. If we didn't get to it, I'm sorry. Hopefully we can follow up with you and answer questions in the future. Look for more WildEarth webinars on other totally different topics in the future as well. And thank you again to Lindsay, Chris, and Jennifer. And we will see you again in the future.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
bye.